The morning they finally canned me, the sky over the Titan Motors factory was the pale gray of dirty motor oil. The air out there tasted like metal shavings, mixed with that sharp ozone bite of heavy industrial electricity. I drove through the factory gates exactly the same way I always had. My windows rolled down, ignoring the freezing cold, because I needed to hear my truck's engine clearly, without any muffled distortion. I could tell you within 8 seconds of turning the ignition key if the ride would run smooth, or if some tiny mechanical part had shifted overnight, desperately needing my attention. That morning, my truck ran completely clean. That was the absolute last normal thing to happen to me for a very long time. I spent 21 years working in vehicle engine diagnostics. I started on the floor of a local auto repair shop in Cincinnati at 21. Learning the hard way, exactly how mechanics from my generation learned what actually mattered. Not from college engineering courses, but through stubborn hands-on patience. I stood right next to older mechanics who knew better, soaking up their wisdom in a way that most people had completely stopped doing years before I even got there. I never held a fancy engineering degree. I possessed something a college degree could never actually produce. I could hear a car engine breathe like a living thing, speaking its own language, and I understood it way before their shiny new diagnostic computers caught up. By the time I finally joined Titan Motors 11 years back, my reputation arrived before I did, in that quiet way news travels in auto industry circles. No loud bragging, just the simple fact that the automotive engineers who needed to know already knew. I had personally stopped a catastrophic engine valve failure at a German hypercar plant just by spotting a tiny harmonic resonance flutter in the exhaust weeks before their high-tech engineering sensors flagged a single thing. I had even caught a major cooling system fault in a new prototype vehicle that had already passed 3 separate factory diagnostic reviews. I caught it because that engine defect was a tiny frequency shift that fell completely beneath the radar of every diagnostic machine in that building, except my own ears. I did all this quietly, without any big celebration and without useless formal documentation, because the bosses bringing me in never demanded endless paperwork. They only cared about results, and I always delivered. At Titan Motors, the Human Resources Department labeled me a senior technical specialist. It was a title vague enough to mean absolutely anything and empty enough to mean nothing inside a corporate giant that dumped almost $800 million into artificial intelligence-driven diagnostic programs and fully automated quality control infrastructure. They completely gutted and rebuilt the factory twice just to house all that shiny new technology. Suddenly, the shop floors looked spotless and the robots moved much quieter. Control room screens constantly glowed with an endless river of sensor data that updated itself 400 times every second, supposedly spotting driveshaft stress down to 3 tiny decimal places of tolerance. The suit running that artificial intelligence diagnostic division, Julian Cross, always loved bragging that our plant had finally become the most precisely monitored car manufacturing environment in the entire automotive world. He preached that exact line at every single meeting I had to attend. And the crazy part, he believed his own corporate hype more every day. Sure, they spun that flawless story inside their annual corporate reports and slick investor pitches. Management handed out brochures claiming our shift to AI diagnostics represented the next logical step. They claimed clean data mattered more than real mechanical experience. In their slick little story, experienced guys like me weren't being erased. We were being elevated, freed from our supposedly flawed human senses, liberated to sit back and blindly interpret their high-level data. Instead of doing the physical work of real detection, Titan Motors sold that lie well. The whole plant was redesigned to fit it. Slick slides in their investor decks backed it up. For a while, the data even agreed. But here's what those spreadsheets couldn't show you. Because data, by its very nature, only tracks what already happened, not what is currently in the process of falling apart. They couldn't measure the truth I heard with my own ears. 21 years standing inside loud running machines. Learning their language through sweat and patience gave me an instinct no computer could ever hope to replicate, no matter how advanced it was. I could hear exactly what an engine was doing now and what it was about to do. This wasn't a magic trick. It was my brain catching patterns faster than any shiny diagnostic tool ever could. Decades of grease and steel built an instinct that was simply never wrong. I couldn't explain it using the fancy tech jargon Julian Cross and his team threw into specs. Honestly, I stopped trying years ago. I just trusted my own ears, and I was always dead right. But on this modern Titan Motors factory floor, my hard-earned experience was the one thing management wanted out of their way. I have a 10-year-old son, Noah. He didn't inherit my quiet nature or my restraint. But the boy completely and unmistakably inherited my deep obsession with the exact sounds engines make when they run right and when they fail. He was only 4 when my wife, Rebecca, died of an aneurysm right in our kitchen, just 30 minutes from the plant. She was just making coffee. The pot finished brewing before we knew anything was wrong. I have raised my boy alone in that very same house ever since. And I did it with that same steady rhythm, pouring the same careful attention into him that I brought to the shop floor every day. He goes to school, he eats his dinner. I listen to him, I correct his mistakes, and I watch the little things. Because if you ask me, those small details are where character gets built. My son loves bragging to strangers that I can hear defects better than any computer. He always says it with the yoger, pure certainty of a kid who hasn't yet learned that real authority requires a fancy corporate degree to be respected, totally unaware why that paper should even matter. The new Aurora X had been Titan Motors' biggest gamble for 3 years. A flashy hybrid electric vehicle. Its powertrain was built on a platform that marketing executives branded as the ultimate mix of performance and environmental responsibility. A useless tagline approved by 17 suits across 4 different departments, stripping away every single ounce of physical truth in the process. We had been testing this new prototype for 8 solid months. Launch day was 7 weeks off, the big investor pitch, just 11 days. You could feel the tension on the floor. Everyone knew the window for bringing up problems was completely shut. And God help anyone who brought up a new defect now. Management would never forgive them. I stepped onto the shop floor at 6:47 that morning, the day they fired me. 90 minutes before my shift even started, I always clock in early. I would spend that first hour just standing next to the engines in the dead quiet long before the daily chaos started. I did not carry scanners, never trusted gadgets during that first hour anyway. Diagnostics are really only helpful once you already know where to look. You and I know if you rely entirely on screens, they will just blind you with false confidence. I stood beside the Aurora X prototype for 12 full minutes. The engine was idling low. It hummed so smooth and steady rookies would swear they heard pure silence. But I did not hear silence. I caught it the way a veteran musician catches a string playing slightly flat. Not like the whole engine was broken, but as a warning sign, something deep inside the guts was not lining up right. It finally hit my ears at minute 7. A hiccup so incredibly tiny it lasted barely a fraction of a second during rotation. A tiny pressure drop in the secondary thermal chamber. It shifted the pitch so quietly that nobody else would have even heard it if they were not actively hunting for it. I always catch these things. I am always listening for the noise that should not be there. Because after 20 years turning wrenches, I knew very well the tiny details that feel out of place are usually the ones that actually matter most. I called a dead stop on the morning run at 7:12 before the hotshot executive Julian Cross even arrived, long before upper management checked their daily schedules. My floor boss, Dennis, a solid guy with 9 years on the line who actually trusted my gut enough to take it seriously, pushed my halt request up the corporate chain without complaining. Julian rolled in at 7:38, driving a slick car that cost 4 times more than my old truck. He parked in a shiny spot they paved for executives 6 months back. The kid was barely 34, with the smug swagger of a guy who has been told his entire life that he was the smartest guy in the room, and he never once doubted his genius. His fancy artificial intelligence division hit their profit targets for 3 straight quarters. The kid actually got his quarterly reports laminated and beautifully framed. Up in his office, I noticed them once but never said a word about it. Julian glared at the stopped line, sneered right at me, then checked his precious monitors. The data showed green across every single system, and he gave me, you know the look. That fake polite smile a boss forces when they are secretly boiling mad. Our systems show a clean run, he said, every parameter within specification. There is a pressure variance in the secondary thermal chamber. I told him straight. Tonal shift on the pressure cycle. 6-point-something milliseconds recurring. Julian glanced at his monitors again, then turned to me. He wore that fake theatrical patience, strictly performing for the gallery. Our AI tracks 400 different data points simultaneously. If we had a pressure leak, we would definitely know it. We would know the exact millisecond it became big enough to trip a sensor. I am warning you about what happens before the computers even notice a problem. So you claim you heard something our digital gear missed? Is that it, Caleb? He spat my name like an insult, hoping pure condescension would win the argument for him. We have 7 weeks until launch, and the major investor pitch is in 11 days. We are not halting prototype testing just because you think you heard a weird noise. I just stared at the prototype engine. I read it the way I always read iron, no awe, no useless sentiment. Just the deep, intense focus of a veteran mechanic translating a metal language the suits could never comprehend. In 72 hours, I told them, the thermal shift will melt that primary coupling. That coupling snaps, and the chain reaction tears right through the whole production line. A heavy silence fell, suffocating the assembly floor. The floor guys suddenly found very urgent reasons to look anywhere but at me or Julian. That is absolutely impossible, Julian snapped. Our plans have specific redundancies built in to prevent that exact kind of cascade. Those backups only watch what your digital sensors can actually see, I shot back. The mechanical flaw I hear hides completely below your sensors. Our CEO, Victoria Sterling, walked in at 8:15, way early, meaning someone had already panicked and run upstairs. At 39 years old, she had been running things at Titan Motors for 3 years. Brought in by a panicked board searching for a ruthless executioner. Someone to turn this Aurora X launch into the ultimate obsession for our future. But Victoria was not a reckless leader. She bet our entire future on the Aurora X only after drowning in spreadsheets. She knew down to the cent what a major system failure right now would cost. With that kind of pressure, walking away now was a luxury she could not afford. She stood quietly and listened to my warning for 6 minutes. Then she looked at me with the exhausted, cold eyes of someone backed into a corner. She was forced to make a brutal call, preferring to swing the axe today than watch us bleed out. Mr. Turner, she began softly. I know your mechanical instincts are strong, and we have valued your experience in the past. But halting this prototype over a sound our AI systems do not see, we cannot do it. The launch schedule is absolutely locked. Respectfully, I told her, a calendar is not going to stop a mechanical disaster. Victoria held my gaze for a moment. Her expression did not even tense up. It just set like concrete, the way a brutal decision locks in once it is final. Your employment at this plant is officially terminated, effective today. Human Resources will provide your final exit paperwork shortly. You are welcome to appeal this through the proper channels. She paused briefly. I am sorry it came to this. She sounded genuine, which only made the betrayal sting worse. The fallout from that moment rattled everyone on the shop floor in different ways. It just depended on how much they had staked on this engine succeeding. Dennis, our shop foreman, just stared down at the concrete floor. 2 junior techs near the assembly line suddenly found their clipboards fascinating. Julian Cross wore the smug grin of a manager who felt completely vindicated without actually getting the deep satisfaction he expected from getting me fired. I reached inside my grease-stained work jacket and pulled out my plant badge. I set it down on the tool table, no loud dramatic scenes. No slamming doors, just the same steady focus I brought to the job. I eyed that flawed car prototype one last time. I felt no anger, no defeat. It was the look of an experienced mechanic who spoke the truth and was ignored. And I knew exactly what kind of safety disaster was heading down the line. I lifted my heavy steel toolbox off the concrete floor by my bench. Just a battered metal case. I had swapped those latches out twice already. Scuffed to hell, bearing the scars of 20 tough years on the floor. Inside were my wrenches and sockets, kept as clean as a surgeon's scalpel. Not because they were expensive, but because relying on them was the core of every job I took on. I headed straight for the exit doors, never looking back once. My kid Noah was waiting near the gate. School was still hours away. I had texted him to wait there instead of boarding the morning bus. He sat on the brick wall near the lot, balancing a paperback novel on his knee. His jacket was wide open in the freezing morning air. Completely lost in the story, the way he always gets with things. He looked up as I crossed the gate. Whatever he saw on my face made him snap it shut. "They did not listen," Noah said. "It wasn't even a question." "No, they didn't," I answered. He just looked at me for a beat. The kid was only 10, but he had been facing tough adult realities since he was 4. It forced him to grow up fast, that quiet maturity born from real early loss. He was not bitter or hardened. He just paid close attention to life. "What are we going to do?" he asked. "What we always do," I said. "Head home. Figure out our next move." He took that in stride. He hopped off the wall and matched my pace as we walked over to the pickup truck. After a few yards, he muttered, "Engine still sounds solid at least." I looked down at him. I felt my face twitch, not quite a full smile, but it occupied the same space. "Yeah," I told him, "the old truck is running fine." Neither of us spoke the obvious truth because we did not need to. My instinct about that dangerous prototype wasn't going away just because they fired me. Sure, I have made mistakes. Anyone working tight tolerances on a real line gets it wrong occasionally. But driving away from the Titan plant that morning, the weight in my chest was not doubt. It was the cold dread of an experienced mechanic watching a ticking time bomb. Back inside the plant, the assembly line sped up. Management signed off on extending the daily automotive test runs, adding 4 extra hours to the shift to erase my morning warning. Julian's crew raised the computer safety thresholds, dismissing the engine heat spikes as mere background noise. A highly dangerous decision made with the arrogant belief in digital charts over 20 years of experience. They ran that assembly floor at absolute capacity. You and I know that sound, the plant's deep hum, pushing an untested car model way past its breaking point. Just 36 hours after they fired me, a night shift tech named Marcus caught a weird vibration in the southern bay, something he did not recognize. Marcus had been walking that factory floor for 4 years. 2 of those on nights. He had that sharp instinct you only get from the graveyard shift. A job needing real focus in a building full of echoing, repetitive noise. The shake was so faint, he honestly wasn't sure if he felt it or was losing his mind. He logged it as a minor glitch in the night report and kept doing his job. The morning shift caught the exact same vibration. 6 hours later, it was noticeably, measurably stronger. But Julian's computer model called it acceptable. Why? Because management had quietly raised the safety limits, and the vibration just hadn't tripped their shiny new dangerous threshold yet. Stick with me here. Julian's engineers saw it, but warning him meant corporate drama they simply didn't want to touch. Victoria was busy running back-to-back investor calls. Dennis, our usual floor supervisor, the one guy who might have spoken up, was on a scheduled day off he couldn't cancel. So the Aurora X prototype kept burning through its 48th hour of extended testing. It ran with the blind confidence of a machine told it was fine by every broken sensor measuring it. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, on the 3rd day after they canned me, the primary thermal coupling on the Aurora X finally gave out. It wasn't some massive Hollywood explosion, but trust me, it was plenty violent. A critical engine part built to control massive heat transfer between the 2 main systems finally hit an absolute breaking point. It was never built to take that heat, so it melted. It failed the way cheap metal always fails when you push it too hard for too long, absolutely catastrophically, venting all that pent-up energy in one single, violently uncontrolled blast. Guys heard the crack across 3 separate buildings. The automated fire suppression kicked in under 4 seconds. The emergency shutdown ripped down the assembly line with the cold, mechanical certainty of a system doing exactly what it was built to do, which was to kill every machine. The massive assembly floor lights dropped to a dim emergency glow. Welding robots locked in place, conveyor belts jerked dead mid-cycle. The facility control room flashed with alarms, blinking in that harsh red-orange color that screamed things had moved way past monitoring and needed immediate saving. 2 safety officers bolted onto the scene within 7 minutes. And what they found was a factory floor that had, in mere moments, turned into a dead, multi-million-dollar graveyard of frozen machines. reeking of sharp chemical fire foam. Management called Julian Cross at 2:22 in the morning. He finally reached the plant at 3:15. On the drive, he ignored 4 calls from panicked engineers and 1 from Victoria's assistant. He probably spent the entire drive inventing a sequence of slick excuses that, as you can guess, instantly fell apart the second he saw the massive wreckage. Victoria Sterling arrived at 3:50. She paced that ruined assembly floor in total silence for 6 minutes. I heard she just stood there, staring at the blown coupling and the dead assembly line. Staring at those control room monitors, which were finally showing her the plain, ugly truth. No room for corporate spreadsheets now. The failure cascade played out exactly how I warned them. Thermal variance, pressure spikes, coupling stress, and then full structural collapse. She just stood there in that control room, staring at those useless computer metrics, completely silent for a long time. Arthur Hayes, the big boss of the Titan Motors investor group, rolled up by 7 a.m. A hard, stern guy in his 60s. You and I know the type. 40 years watching arrogant suits make costly mistakes because they ignore real experience. But reality always catches up with them eventually. He marched across the factory floor, flanked by 2 corporate associates. He asked the tough questions, and he actually listened. He checked the repair bills. Hundreds of millions, once they added up the massive cascade damage ripping through our production line. He reviewed their glossy investor timeline, then stared at the completely ruined launch schedule. Finally, he read the early morning reports written by our own engineering guys, proving my real-world warning was right, and the defect started exactly where I predicted, and spiraled into a total disaster exactly like I warned them. Then the chairman asked just one single question. He did not care about the broken parts or the delayed launch schedule. "Where is Turner?" I was working out in my garage when Victoria's luxury sedan pulled up. Just a modest single-car workshop attached right to the side of the house. My son Noah and I spent 2 years of weekends turning it into a workspace. It is not huge, but I keep it organized with the absolute precision of a master mechanic. You and I both know that feeling of a quiet shop where you are entirely in your element. My wrenches hung on the pegboard in the very deliberate order. I could grab any tool I needed, even in total darkness. A cheap shop light threw bright, clean illumination across my workbench. I painted that concrete floor gray 3 years ago. Even the tightest corners are still spotless. I was swapping an alternator on a neighbor's old car, doing it as a quick favor for $30. Way less than the job was worth, but it was all the poor guy could afford. My boy Noah sat on a wooden stool tucked away in the corner, working on his school homework, with a heavy textbook propped up against my toolbox. He looked up when that luxury car parked outside and just quietly watched it. The door swung open. He gave it that sharp, analyzing look he definitely inherited from me. He sized up the car first, the fancy brand, the slick paint, the hurried parking job. Then he watched the executive step out, before finally turning his gaze back over to me. I had not even bothered to look up from that engine block. But my shoulders tensed. Noah knew my reaction whenever I felt an outsider stepping onto my home turf. Victoria Sterling marched up my driveway, but she was not wearing her usual sharp boardroom suit. She still wore the wrinkled clothes she had thrown on at 3 in the morning when the disaster call came. She had not changed, and honestly, she looked like an executive who just spent hours facing the crushing reality of a mistake she could never undo. I finally locked eyes with her from underneath the hood of that beat-up sedan. I let her stand there in the silence. "We need your help," she pleaded. I stared her down for a second. "I know. The thermal coupling failed." "You know that look?" She paused. "The system cascade matched your warning. I owe you an admission before I ask for anything. You were dead right. We really should have listened." I slammed the sedan's hood shut and wiped my greasy hands on a shop rag. I just stared. Honestly, I had been waiting for this day, but I was not surprised when it finally came, and I felt zero satisfaction. "What is the factory line status?" I asked. "Shut down. Our automated diagnostics are feeding us conflicting data about the secondary damage," she admitted. "You cannot see the damage because those sensors were never designed to catch real-world wear," I said. "No," I folded my rag. I glanced over at my boy Noah. He watched from his stool, giving us that steady focus. A silent look passed between us, no words, no gestures. Just that deep understanding you only get from years of learning each other's quiet spaces. Your fancy computer systems will not tell you what really matters, I pointed out. I can tell you what is broken. I know, she replied. Then let's get moving. Victoria scanned my garage, taking in the manual tools and the neighbor's beat-up sedan. She stared at Noah sitting quietly with his textbook, and she stared like she was looking at an alien world, miles away from her sterile spreadsheets and corporate metrics. My assistant can arrange, she began. I will drive my own truck, I cut in. I stepped inside the house and came back 3 minutes later wearing my worn jacket. I told Noah to call if he needed anything. He promised me he would. He spoke with the complete, unbothered calm of a kid who has held down the fort plenty of times before. He knew his old man was coming back, just like I always did. Victoria watched us, a strange, uncomfortable emotion flickering across her face that she could not hide. She quickly turned back toward her expensive ride, giving us a second of true privacy. I pulled up to the Titan plant 40 minutes later. Drove my own truck, parked out in the main lot. I walked through those main doors carrying the same battered toolbox I had hauled out 48 hours ago. And the folks on the production floor who saw me reacted differently, depending on how much of the truth they actually knew. Dennis had canceled his day off and been grinding on site since 4 in the morning. He met me right at the bay entrance and just said, "Good to have you back." He said it like a guy who meant every single word. A few fellow technicians who had been working the line during the initial disaster nodded at me with genuine heavy relief. We have all been there, waiting for the guy management should have heard on day one. Julian Cross stood by his useless computer screens. He did not say a word when I walked past. The suit looked gutted, staring like a man who just watched his perfect digital world crumble. And honestly, that is always the most expensive kind of loss. I marched to the center of the assembly floor and stood dead still for 2 minutes. The emergency alarm systems were still partially blaring. The whole plant sounded different now, eerily quiet here, jarring and irregular there. We have all heard it, a broken machine stuck mid-cycle, blindly waiting for what comes next. I just stood and listened. I walked the assembly line slowly, stopping at 3 spots, leaning in close without touching the machinery. Just listening, with the deep focus of a mechanic reading fine print. At the 3rd stop, I crouched by a secondary coupling module in the east wing and listened for 20 seconds. Then I stood up and looked. Right at those engineering suits, huddled together at a safe distance. The main failure is documented, I told them. But you've got a secondary stress fracture in that eastern module. It's hidden, your fancy sensors missed it because the crack is inside the internal bore, not on the outer housing. Restart this line without replacing it, and the stress snaps the metal in 3 to 4 hours flat. Claire, the veteran lead of the engineering crew, heard me. She had 12 years at this plant. She just looked at Julian. Julian stared at his monitoring screens. The digital data showed 0 issues out east. He glared back at me. On what basis? Julian began. Pull that module, Claire ordered flatly. She spoke softly, with the heavy finality of someone who knows what happens when managers ignore real hands-on experience. We will inspect it, so the module was pulled. Taking it off the assembly line ate up 40 solid minutes. Her team snaked a fiber scope inside that internal bore, and there lay the fracture. It was tiny. The scope needed 2 full scans just to confirm the defect. But it was big enough, under the Aurora X cycle loads, to crash the module exactly when I warned. The entire production floor went dead silent. In that moment, a hard truth that had been building for years was finally staring those blind, data-driven executives right in the face. Arthur Hayes had been waiting quietly near the control room door. Watching the module inspection, he spoke up first. He spoke quietly, without any drama, just a leader admitting what was staring them in the face. The AI software did not prevent this failure. It missed the diagnosis completely. It never flagged this secondary defect. Caleb prevented this disaster, and we fired him for it. He locked eyes with Julian. I want a full report on every diagnostic threshold change made in the 48 hours before that failure. He paused. Every single change. Show me the timestamps and authorization logs. Julian opened his mouth to speak. Arthur just raised a hand, shutting down the excuse before it could even start. I spent 11 grueling days on the job. going right through the entire diagnostic assessment of this vehicle line. I worked right alongside Claire's crew. Our partnership felt like a genuine collaboration between allies who had always fought on the exact same side, but somehow never stood in the same room together. Claire was brilliant and thorough. She had zero interest in anything but the raw truth. Her team treated me with the quiet respect you only earn by proving your expertise, which is a completely different and far more durable kind of respect than any corporate title can buy. When we compiled the final damage assessment, the scale was much wider than Victoria had hoped for, yet slightly less catastrophic than she feared. 3 entire sections of the assembly line needed major rework. You know how it goes. We saved the prototype, but our launch schedule got slammed by 9 weeks. Management scrambled to reschedule the investor presentation. The big investors were getting seriously nervous. Arthur Hayes handled those panicked calls with that same patient, straight shooting style he always had. Those meetings were brutal, but we survived them. Titan Motors didn't collapse entirely, which was the exact disaster staring us in the face. But our immediate future had changed completely, and every suit upstairs knew it well. But something else changed too, though much quieter. People inside the company finally started seeing the truth. Julian Cross somehow managed to keep his job, but they completely gutted his division's authority. Their fancy automated diagnostic systems became basic tools, not the final judge. Just tools pointing out where we should look, instead of almighty algorithms pretending to know the absolute truth. Of course, they never publicly called it a demotion. Saving face is a currency these giant companies spend constantly behind closed doors. But down on the shop floor, we all understood perfectly. Victoria asked for a sit-down with me on the 12th day after the diagnostic checks wrapped up and our massive production line rebuild officially began. She met me in a second-floor conference room, keeping me completely out of her office. I noticed that detail right away. It wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate choice. She had a solid offer, laying it right out without any corporate fluff. She wanted me taking on a brand new role, Director of Technical Integrity. Hear me out, that specific position had never existed inside Titan Motors before. Honestly, that fancy title meant a lot less to me than the actual job. My job was building a human-led inspection routine alongside the computers, holding absolute authority to halt any production or testing process if our hands-on checks caught a flaw the machines missed. The new position offered a salary that was, by any realistic standard, a huge upgrade from my old shop floor wages. It came with real benefits and the legally binding power to finally do the exact thing I had tried to warn them about before getting fired. I listened to her entire offer carefully before giving her my response, which is exactly how I've always listened to everything in my life. I'll take the job, I told her. One condition. Victoria patiently waited. I said, the line techs who caught the defect before failure, that night shift worker, and those 2 young engineers on your team who stayed quiet because they feared getting fired. They all need to hear that their gut instincts were completely right. I added, and they must know that speaking up in the future isn't just allowed, it's absolutely required. I looked her straight in the eye. I said, the real problem wasn't just what your fancy computer systems missed. It was that your own shop floor guys didn't feel safe speaking up. Victoria just stared at me in silence. She slowly nodded, with the look of someone finally accepting a harsh truth they'd known all along. I'll handle it, she said quietly. In writing, I shot back. Hard policy, not just talk. In writing, she agreed. I took the job. Noah finally visited the Titan Auto plant for the first time one Saturday morning. Exactly 3 weeks after my official return. The shop floor was running real light that weekend, so we could walk the line safely without disrupting any of the crews. I walked him through the whole plant myself. I showed my boy Noah what really mattered, without speaking. I let the production floor speak through its own sounds. We paused whenever a station sounded unique. I let him stand and listen until he got his fill. I didn't bother explaining what those machines did or what their official purposes were. I wanted him to experience them purely as sound. That's how I learned a raw language before they push data on you. You have to hear it first before you can truly know it. Noah barely asked any questions. That was strange for him, but around heavy iron, he went quieter than he ever did anywhere else. I knew that silence meant deep, real focus, not just some kid spacing out on a tour. As we walked together through the eastern assembly bay, Noah paused twice to listen to certain things that I had already noticed, mentally logging them into my own assessment of the line's status. I didn't ask him about either sound. Our factory visit wasn't supposed to be some official audit. The real reason I brought him was much simpler than that. I wanted my son to see my world and understand what my hands actually did every day. Right out in the middle of the main production floor. Noah froze and tilted his head. It was a look I knew so well I recognized it before I even knew why. "What is it?" I asked. "Something in the conveyor," he replied. He pointed directly toward the eastern bay. "A tiny rattle," he said. I stood still and listened. I caught it on the second cycle. A tiny misalignment in the tensioner, completely invisible to their digital diagnostics. But it's exactly the kind of friction that eats a machine alive over time under heavy loads. I looked down at my boy. He was still standing there, head tilted, listening with absolute focus. "Good ear, kid," I said. Noah gave me that look, the one where he already knew he was right, but was still glad his old man agreed. "You taught me how," he said. We stood there for a few more minutes, soaking up the heavy, rhythmic heartbeat of the line. Just sharing a moment with a machine that, for now, was doing exactly what we built it to do. Later that week, I filed a formal work order for that eastern conveyor tensioner. Sure enough, Claire's crew found the misalignment on their very first check. Fixing it took 20 minutes, zero downtime for the line. Meanwhile, way up in corporate, on the 37th floor of the Titan Motors building. You know the kind of place, where the suits looked down on the rest of the city from above. Inside was an old filing system that his secretary kept with absolute precision, knowing a company's past paper trail is its biggest weapon. Right there among those files, pulled from the dead files right after the Aurora X recall proved they should have listened to me, was a thick folder with my name on the tab, Caleb Turner. Tucked inside that file was a single piece of internal mail dated from the exact month I first started at Titan Motors, typed up by the old plant manager who originally hired me. The paper was a blunt review of my actual job credentials. It openly admitted that on paper, my lack of college degrees made me completely unqualified for engineering. But it strongly recommended they hire me anyway. All because of the rare hands-on mechanical talent I showed during the Canon 2250 practical trials. Picture this. Right beneath the formal recommendation in my file lay a quick, handwritten note. My big boss Arthur Hayes read it right after confirming the new data-driven director. He dropped that paper onto his heavy mahogany desk, staring quietly before shutting my personnel folder. The label simply read, "Internal Note." The sharpest engine diagnostics specialist this car plant had ever tested. Hayes actually wrote those exact words himself 11 years ago, back when he still ran our factory advisory board and personally evaluated green mechanics like me. He had completely forgotten he ever wrote that. But staring at my file today, we both knew his old instinct was dead right. Down in the employee parking lot, my old pickup idled in the fading afternoon light. I just sat there with the window down, listening to the engine hum like always. The engine turned over beautifully, clean, even, and honest, exactly how a machine should sound. I finally slipped it into gear and drove home to my boy.